Trapped since birth in a lightless bunker, a young man knows nothing of the world outside. His only reality is the brutal, relentless training and psychological torment inflicted by his own father. Every day, he endures beatings so severe that the thought of sunlight and freedom feels like a distant dream. His father, the architect of his suffering, keeps him isolated with the words of apocalypse being near, filling his mind with the cruel words that his mother is dead, driven to suicide jumping off bridge by an impending apocalypse. Yet, in the depths of his despair, the protagonist clings to a single hope: escape. He dreams of breaking free, of feeling the warmth of the sun, of meeting other humans, and of experiencing the world he's only read about in the bunker's library in his free time offered by his father. He waits for the right moment, the rare instance when his father's guard slips. One day, after enduring a savage beating from his father during training, he pretends to pass out, hoping this will be his chance. As his father turns to leave, the young man seizes a piece of broken debris, aiming to strike. But his father, ever vigilant, catches the movement out of the corner of his eye. With brutal efficiency, he subdues his son once more, crushing his hopes with every blow. His father's fist crashed into him, and the world went black. When he regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was his father looming over him, eyes cold, waiting. The boy barely had time to catch his breath before his father spoke, his voice like steel. "You dared to use a weapon against me instead of your hands. For that, you'll face double the punishment in tomorrow's training." The words were a command, not a discussion. "Now sleep," his father ordered, "and be ready for what's coming." He left. Every day as the lights in the room flickered off and electricity in room turns off and noises disappears, and his focus on listening, a strange thing which happens was he could hear the distant hum of the city, the soft chirping of birds, and the faint creak of wheels turning far away. Night after night, this strange being repeated, making him wonder it was really daytime in ground when his father tells bedtime in bunker, and his father was lying about everything, about the apocalypse as well, about his mother's death, and even about the world outside. Determined to uncover the truth, the boy resolved to break free from his father's control and find his mother. But as he plotted his escape, his father, moving like a shadow through the tunnels, received a mysterious call from someone named River. Their conversation was cryptic, with his father demanding to know why he was being contacted even when he warned only to contact if emergency. He told to let him leave and call, but do not know who he was mentioning. He let his phone to break, and the father's face twisted into a sinister grin, a soundless, eerie laugh escaping his lips. Next scene, the boy, now tied up, begged to be released, but his father ignored him. Desperately, he struggled against the ropes, feeling them give way just as his father stepped closer. "What's the challenge today?" the boy asked, hoping to buy time, to understand the shift in his father's demeanor. But the answer was chilling. "Plans have changed," his father said, voice devoid of emotion. "From now on, you'll do nothing. No more training. Just sit in that chair." Confusion and fear gripped the boy. What did this mean? Would he never get the chance to find his mother? Panic surged through him, and with every ounce of strength, he tried to break free. His father watched, his laughter growing darker, more twisted. A sharp slap to the face left the boy stunned, but still, he fought against the ropes. His father, in a fit of rage, hurled objects at him, each one striking with the intent to break his spirit. But the boy refused to yield. His resentment towards his father burned hotter with each passing second. And then, in a moment of sheer determination, he felt the ropes snap. Freedom, however fleeting, filled him with a rush of adrenaline. But instead of the fury he expected from his father, he saw something unexpected: tears in his father's eyes. "Why?" the boy whispered, confused by this sudden change. Before he could get an answer, his father's fist connected with his face once more, and darkness swallowed him again. In the depths of his unconscious mind, the protagonist clung to a memory of his father's voice, stern and unwavering. Rule number 1. His father had said, "In the apocalypse, never leave the basement. There is no safer place than the bunker. The defenses here can withstand anything for 126 years. Leaving this sanctuary would be like jumping into a fire pit." You must not, under any circumstances, leave. When the protagonist finally regained consciousness, a cold dread washed over him. His father was gone. This was peculiar. His father had never disappeared before, except when he slept. Unease gnawed at him as he recalled his father's recent strange behavior, the air of something imminent hanging between them. He glanced around the bunker, his heart skipping a beat. All the doors were wide open. None were locked, not even his own. The sudden freedom was dizzying. He knew this was his chance, the opportunity he had only dared to dream of. Without hesitation, he bolted through the open doors, his mind racing. If his father were here, he would have already stopped him. So why was everything so open? His desperation fueled his actions as he found a ladder and climbed it, light flooding his vision as he reached the surface. For the first time, he opened his eyes to a world beyond the bunker. The city before him was bustling with life. People laughing, talking, and living in the warmth of a beautiful day. An old, bald man approached, his voice gruff yet curious. "Kid, what are you doing in the middle of the road?" The protagonist felt a surge of joy, an actual person, but the man's bewildered expression reminded him not to let his guard down. His father could return at any moment. Panic set in. He had to get as far away as possible. He had dreamed of this day, of escaping the basement, and now it was real. He was free, but something gnawed at him. Why were the doors open? Was it a malfunction? No, his father was far too meticulous to make such a mistake. A chilling thought crossed his mind. Had his father done this on purpose? He shook it off as impossible. After all, his father had drilled into him the importance of never leaving the basement. As he wandered through the city, he marveled at the peace and normalcy around him. People were eating, laughing, enjoying their day. His father's warnings seemed like lies. How could this be the world he was told to fear? Just as the protagonist began to relax, his father's words echoed in his mind. The end finds us without warning. Suddenly, the sky darkened as a flock of birds scattered, screeching in terror. All eyes turned skyward, and what they saw defied comprehension. A massive object, like a planet, was descending upon the city. And from it, something emerged, something monstrous. Panic gripped the streets as people realized the horror approaching them. The protagonist's blood ran cold. This was the moment his father had warned him about. The monsters descended, and the city, once bustling with life, erupted into chaos. Screams filled the air as the creatures began their brutal slaughter, ripping through the crowd with savage ferocity. The protagonist remembered his father's final words. When the apocalypse comes, the world will drown in blood and despair. Only the strong will survive. So never to leave the basement, and if something danger comes off or location of bunker is revealed, just forget rule number 1 inch now. Amidst the carnage, as blood flowed and terror consumed the city, the apocalypse had begun. Just as his father had warned, the apocalypse had indeed arrived. The protagonist began to wonder if his mother's death, too, was not a lie. Chaos reigned as people ran in terror, fleeing from the monstrous creatures that ravaged the city. In the midst of this pandemonium, a hand grabbed his father's hand. The boy's mind raced, confused by his father's sudden appearance. Why was he here? "Run for your life," his father commanded, leaving no room for hesitation. Without a word, the boy followed his father, their legs propelling them through streets soaked in fear. Everywhere they looked, people were being slaughtered, devoured by the monstrous beasts. They sprinted toward a bridge, the only visible escape route. The boy tried to speak, but his father silenced him and told, "Stop talking and run." They dashed across the bridge, but the relentless monsters were in pursuit. Suddenly, one of the creatures grabbed the protagonist's leg, its grip like a vice. Panic surged through him as he desperately tried to wrench free. His father, eyes wild with determination, seized a large stone and smashed it down on the creature's head, sending it plummeting off the bridge. The boy's leg throbbed in pain where the monster had gripped him. Despite the injury, he tried to run, but the agony slowed him down. The monsters were closing in. Despair took hold as he stumbled and fell, his injured leg betraying him. "Run!" his father shouted again, But the boy shook his head, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. I can't. Just you go. He told to his father. You've never cared about me before, so why now? He speaks in mind to his shock. His father extended his hand toward him, eyes filled with a resolve the boy had never seen before. You will survive, his father said, pulling him to his feet. I have a plan. The boy hesitated, disbelief clouding his thoughts. What plan? His father had always been distant, even cruel. What could he possibly have prepared? But something in his father's demeanor, something in his recent strange behavior, made him take his father's hand. With a firm grip, his father helped him up. Run, he commanded, but didn't explain further. As the boy turned to flee, something was pressed into his hand. There was no time to question it. He ran as fast as his injured leg would allow, sprinting away from the bridge. When he finally dared to glance back, the bridge was gone, collapsed, destroyed, as if it had been torn from the earth. There was no sign of his father, just the wreckage and the abyss where the bridge had once stood. What had happened? Was this the plan his father spoke of? Why had the bridge fallen? He remembered his father's words, the insistence that he would survive, and wondered why. Why would his father go to such lengths to save him now, after all the years of torment? Why now? The boy's heart ached with confusion and sorrow. Everything he had dreamed of, life above ground, peace, and beauty, was shattered by the apocalypse. His goals, his hopes, all vanished in the face of this new hellish reality. He looked down at the object in his hand, the one his father had given him. It was a note, a small slip of white paper. But before he could unfold it, a monstrous figure appeared in front of him. Terror gripped him as he realized he couldn't run, the pain in his leg anchoring him in place. The protagonist was in excruciating pain, his leg throbbing from the injury. As the monster lunged at him, he felt utterly powerless. He couldn't even stand, let alone fight back. Despair consumed him, dragging him to rock bottom. Was this really how it would end? He was going to die here, alone and broken. His gaze fell to his hand, where the note his father had left him lay crumpled. In that moment, with tears welling up in his eyes as he read the words, a wave of shock hit him like a tidal wave. His mother was alive. His father had left him this information at the very last moment. A final act, the protagonist's despair began to shift. He couldn't give up, not now. He had to survive, no matter how impossible it seemed. The burning desire to find his mother fueled him, igniting a fire deep within his soul. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. His father's words echoed in his mind, a grim reminder: human won't survive the apocalypse. They don't have the strength or knowledge to endure what's coming. Even if they survive one attack, death will come again and again. He had once asked his father, if that's true, how am I supposed to survive? Am I going to die like everyone else? As the monster's fist barreled toward him, ready to end his life, the protagonist's mind raced through these memories. In that split second, just before impact, a vision of his father appeared in his thoughts, stern and commanding. Have you forgotten everything I taught you? The words snapped him back to reality. With a surge of adrenaline, the protagonist dodged the monster's attack, narrowly escaping death. The monster roared in fury, its rage intensifying. But the protagonist wasn't the same helpless boy he had been moments ago. He remembered his father's words, "You're different from ordinary humans. The difference is that you know how to survive." His eyes scanned the ground, and he spotted something, a sharp, weapon-like object partially buried in the dirt. He grabbed it, his grip tightening with newfound resolve. The monster charged at him, its eyes burning with savage intent. The protagonist braced himself, every ounce of his training and survival instincts kicking in. With a primal yell, he launched himself at the monster, weapon in hand. He used every bit of knowledge his father had drilled into him, every lesson, every skill. The fight was brutal, the monster relentless, but the protagonist was determined. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for his future, for the chance to find his mother. With all his might, he drove the weapon into the monster's head, the impact shuddering through his arms. He had done it. He had survived. But this was only the beginning. The city was in ruins, with buildings obliterated and chaos reigning everywhere. The air was thick with despair, overwhelmed by the loss and dire situation. The sounds of destruction and reminder of the apocalypse that had descended. People were in a small hole beneath the debris, trying to remain hidden from the horrors above. One of them, a woman, was talking to a person. "It's been 4 days already, and the cops are doing nothing. We have to move from here. There's no food left." One man came at her nervously. "Stop talking," he hissed. "You're making everyone around here uncomfortable." The woman bristled. "I'm not even speaking loudly. How am I making anyone uncomfortable?" The man didn't bother replying and instead turned away, muttering under his breath, "Forget about it." She was talking with the corpse of a person as he walked off. A young girl approached him, her voice hesitant. "Excuse me." Man asked if she have searched the vicinity for food. The young girl sighed. "I've looked everywhere. There's nothing left." Determined, the girl replied, "I haven't checked the other side yet. Don't give up. We might still find something." He nodded, grateful for her persistence. "Thank you for helping. Most people are too exhausted or too scared to do anything. It means a lot." The girl shook her head. "No need to thank me. I'm just doing what I can, and I am not such a great." As the man tried to keep their spirits up, urging the group to hang on a little longer, the girls set off to search for food. After some time, she came across two people rummaging through the rubble. Approaching them, she asked, "Have you found any food?" One of the two men looked up, his face smeared with dirt. "Yeah, we found some bread under the debris," he said, tearing into the packet and stuffing the bread into their mouth. The girl's eyes widened in shock. "Why are you eating it all? Why aren't you sharing with the others?" The man sneered, "I never agreed to share. That was a decision others made, not me." The girl's anger flared. "You've been taking your fair share from the group every day, and now you're hoarding what little we have left?" The man shrugged dismissively. "I don't recall agreeing to anything." Furious, the girl threatened, "I'm going to report this to the others." The man's expression darkened. "Go ahead and try. Do you think we'll just sit back and let you?" Unfazed, the girl shot back, "You won't catch me. I'm good at running away, remember?" The man laughed mockingly. "Let's see you run with shaking legs, little brat." But before he could say more, a distant scream pierced the air. They all froze, the sound sending chills down their spines. It was common to hear screams now, but every one of them still carried the weight of fear. Trying to regain her composure, the girl sat down on the floor, her mind racing. Just then, she noticed something under the debris, a hidden piece of bread. As she turned to her group, the men, who was waiting for her, asked if she had found anything. "Yeah, I looked over there," she lied smoothly. "There's nothing left." The men believed her, nodding in agreement. "As long as we're alive, that's all that matters. We can always find more food later." But just as they were starting to relax, a monstrous figure appeared from the shadows. It moved swiftly, smashing through the debris, its massive form casting a dark shadow over the terrified survivors. The girl barely had time to react before the creature lunged at the men, who were caught off guard by the sudden attack. The man, struck by monster, was pinned to the ground. He screamed for help, his voice filled with desperation, but the girl hesitated only for a moment before turning and running, guilt clawing at her as she whispered, "Sorry, I'm not a good person." She didn't look back as the chaos behind her escalated, the man's cries fading as she sprinted through the ruins. The other man watched her flee, thinking that she can be the bait to monster in front of them. But as she mentioned, she was an agile survivor, quick and cunning. He could get through monster with agility. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, the city a blur around her. The men realized that, as the girl had said, she was good at running away, and she proved it now, slipping through narrow gaps and evading the creature with an agility that left them stunned. Finally, she found a moment's respite, leaning against a crumbling wall as she gasped for breath. But her relief was short-lived. As she caught her breath, she noticed a protagonist nearby, hiding in the shadows. Startled, she accidentally bumped into him, causing him to stumble and fall. Panic surged through her as she wondered if he was hurt, but before she could check, she saw a monster lurking behind him. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly pulled the protagonist into the shadows with her, hoping the creature wouldn't notice them. After what felt like an eternity, the monster moved on. The girl sighed in relief, thinking they were safe. But when the protagonist woke up, he recoiled in fear, his father's warnings echoing in his mind. Never trust humans. Who are you? He demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. What are you trying to do to me? The girl blinked, confused by his reaction. What do you mean? I was just trying to hide you so the monster wouldn't see you. But the boy, remembering every word his father had drilled into him, remained wary. He had been taught that humans were deceitful, only looking out for themselves. And yet, as his stomach growled with hunger, he realized he hadn't eaten in 5 days since leaving the basement. He was reaching his limit. The young girl hesitated before speaking. I have nothing to eat. The protagonist, slightly confused, replied, Why are you telling me this? I didn't even ask. The girl fidgeted, looking down. You just looked hungry, so I thought, just in case you asked. As she spoke, a small packet of bread slipped from her pocket and fell to the ground. She froze, unsure of what to say next. The boy's eyes narrowed as he looked at the bread. What's that? The protagonist, having never seen bread before, stared at it with curiosity. The sight of it made his stomach growl with hunger, but he asked cautiously, Is that food? The girl quickly shook her head. No, it's not, she lied, hoping to gloss over her mistake. The protagonist, noticing her nervousness, became suspicious. He told that why would he trust human? Why to trust her words? Her reaction told him that it was indeed food, and he needed it. He decided that if she didn't cooperate, he might have to take it by force. Reluctantly, the girl handed over half of the bread. The protagonist looked at her, wondering why she would willingly decrease her own rations. You'll be at a disadvantage if you give me this, he said. The girl replied firmly, You have to pay me back 4 times as much, so don't forget it. The protagonist accepted the bread, thinking to himself, Humans really are cunning creatures. He ate the bread quickly, savoring the taste, then stood up to try to leave. Where are you going now? The girl asked. Now that I've eaten, I'm going to move on, the protagonist replied. The girl looked at him incredulously. In this situation, there's nowhere to go. The entire area is surrounded by monsters. The protagonist stopped and turned face to her as soon as she told that, I know this neighborhood better than you. Don't gout. There are monsters out there. Protagonist asked her, Where's the subway then? Why do you want to go to the subway? She asked, confused. Because it's safe there, the boy explained. It's a good place to hide, and there's a route we can take to avoid the monsters. The subway also makes it harder for them to detect humans. Reluctantly, the girl led him toward the subway, thinking he was an idiot for moving around in such a dangerous situation. She regretted sharing her bread with him, considering him reckless and clueless for not recognizing food earlier. When they finally reached the subway entrance, the girl was stunned. The subway wasn't there anymore, just an empty void where it once was. The protagonist frowned. Are you sure this is the right place? I know the subway is underground. You are trying to deceive me, right? The girl panicked, realizing how bad this looked. Of course. I'm just trying to find the entrance. Give me a moment. Suddenly, an old man appeared, his face stern. The girl was nervous to see him, not expecting anyone else to be around. The old man with white coat, who seemed like a doctor, spoke gruffly. What are you doing here? The protagonist replied, Who are you? The old man waved off the question. That's a rude way to talk to someone. Introductions can wait. Follow me. The girl, still uneasy, asked, Where are we going? The old man simply said, Weren't you looking for the subway? He led them to an underground section where many people had taken refuge. The sight was overwhelming. Women and men huddled together in despair, their faces etched with fear and hopelessness. The protagonist observed them closely, realizing there were more humans here than he expected. He could see people of all types, some who seemed weak and helpless, others who looked dangerous and unpredictable. His instincts, honed by his father's teachings, told him that more humans meant more risks. He needed to be careful. The old man introduced himself as Dr. Huang Biao Yam, explaining that he had been searching for medicine when he stumbled upon them. He mentioned that he hadn't encountered anyone else above ground except for the two of them. The girl quickly introduced herself as Haru. Dr. Huang recognized the dress she was wearing and asks, "Were you a student at virtual middle school?" She nodded. "Yes. How did you know?" "My hospital was across from your school, near the shopping mall," he replied. Haru thought for a moment, trying to remember if there was a hospital there. Turning to the protagonist, the old man asked, "And what's your name?" The protagonist hesitated. He had never been given a name before. "I don't have one." Dr. Huang was surprised but didn't press the issue. "That's fine. You can tell me when you're ready, once we get to know each other better." Suddenly, a woman shouted, "Dr. Huang!" Something was wrong. A man was severely injured, and his wound, which had been temporarily stabilized, was worsening. Blood was seeping through the makeshift bandages, and the situation was dire. Dr. Huang quickly assessed the situation. He needs surgery immediately. If the wound gets infected, it could be fatal. He pulled out his medical equipment and began to prepare for surgery. The protagonist, watching closely, was puzzled. He had read about doctors in books, people who treated others for a price. But here, Dr. Huang was offering his help without any apparent payment. Curious, the protagonist asked, "What's the price for treating him?" The old man looked at him, confused. "Price? There's no price. A doctor's job is to help those who are hurt." The protagonist was taken aback. He couldn't understand why the doctor would help without any guarantee of payment. It didn't make sense to him. Was the doctor just being foolish, or was there something he didn't understand about human nature? As Dr. Huang prepared to operate, the injured man thanked him profusely with a hug, despite the pain. But then, the man noticed something that made him uneasy. He saw the name on Dr. Huang's chest and realized that he was a veterinarian, not a human doctor. "Wait," the man said, panic rising in his voice. "You're a vet. Can you really perform surgery on a human?" Dr. Huang smiled reassuringly. "Humans are technically animals, too. Don't worry, I've got this." The man's fear spiked, but before he could protest further, Dr. Huang knocked him out with a brick, using it as a makeshift anesthetic as there wasn't any anesthetic available at the moment. "Sorry about that," he muttered, "but it's necessary." The protagonist watched, his suspicion of humans growing. He couldn't fathom why anyone would trust someone so easily, especially in such a dangerous situation. To him, humans were proving to be as unpredictable and dangerous as the monsters outside. He sat alone, his thoughts tangled in the mess that his life had become. He knew it was the right call to leave, to get out of that place. There was no point in staying, no need to keep watching the scene unfold. But as he sat there, he couldn't help but wonder what to do next. The only thing he had, the only clue that might lead him to the truth, was a picture his father had given him. A photo taken during his childhood. On the back of it was a note, scrawled in his mother's delicate handwriting. "Mom says alive." The words haunted him, a cryptic message that he couldn't decipher. He had no idea where to begin looking for her, no clear path forward. All he had was this photo. Every time he looked at the picture, a wave of unease washed over him. There was something off about it, something unnatural. The background of the photo showed strange, alien-like flowers growing behind his family. The flowers were unlike anything he had ever seen, even in the wildest corners of the world. Their bizarre shapes and colors seemed otherworldly, as if they didn't belong in this reality. He had scoured every flower book he could find, searching for any information about them, but he came up empty-handed every time. These flowers weren't documented anywhere. He thought that if those flowers only grew in a specific location, they might be the key to finding where the picture was taken. If he could figure that out, maybe he could find his mother. The photo was his only clue, and he held on to it like a lifeline. He couldn't afford to lose it. But how was he going to identify those flowers? Who could help him? As he sat there, pondering his next move in the next scene. "Hey you! Gather everyone!" It was a gruff command, cutting through the air with a sharp edge. The speaker was someone of authority, someone who didn't tolerate disobedience. He continued, "Get started. Bring everyone over here. If they refuse, use any method you want." People began to stir, murmuring among themselves. Confusion spread like wildfire. Why were they being gathered? What was going on? One man, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, spoke up. Why are you making us gather here? Are you even allowed to manhandle us like this without any explanation? Are you listening to me? The person who had issued the command turned towards the man, his gaze cold and unyielding. He had a presence about him that was almost inhuman, something that sent shivers down the spine. There was a darkness in his eyes, a depth that hinted at the ability to see straight into a person's soul. He could sense what people were hiding, see the fear behind their eyes, even when they tried to mask it with bravado. The man who had questioned him faltered under that gaze, his tough exterior crumbling. "Don't come any closer," the man warned, but his voice was shaky now, betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. The boss ignored and moved swiftly, delivering a brutal punch to the man's stomach. The force of the blow was so intense that the man doubled over in pain, gasping for air. The crowd around them recoiled in shock, unsure of what to make of the situation. The boss grabbed the man by his collar, pulling him up so that their faces were inches apart. His expression was twisted, a mix of anger and something else, something darker. "Show me your true form," he demanded, his voice low and menacing. The man in his grip whimpered, his tough act completely shattered. "Stop, no more," he pleaded. Before the situation could escalate further, a girl appeared, rushing towards them. "Boss," she called out, urgency in her voice. The figure, apparently the leader of this group, released his grip on the man and turned his attention to her. "What is it?" he asked, his tone still laced with irritation. "Some people aren't here," she replied, a note of worry creeping into her voice. "There was a boy and a girl, and another injured person. I couldn't gather everyone. That zone was given to that thug, but he didn't listen and suddenly disappeared." The leader's expression darkened. "We couldn't get that guy under control?" The leader boss. "I'll handle it myself. I want to see the look on their faces when I meet them." The girl glanced down at the man who was still lying on the ground, clutching his stomach in pain. "What do we do about him?" she asked. "Tie him up and throw him outside," the leader replied coldly. The man on the ground, sensing his impending doom, began to beg. "Please, don't throw me out. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't throw me out." Meanwhile, the protagonist found himself slipping into a dark dream. It was the kind of nightmare that felt too real, like he was being swallowed whole by something. He was in a place that seemed to defy reality, the ground beneath him pressing down on his feet, holding him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. It was suffocating, and no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. Panic gripped him as he tried to understand where he was, but just as the fear reached its peak, he jolted awake. His eyes snapped open, and he found himself staring at a group of people. They were watching him intently, their faces unreadable. Confused and still reeling from the nightmare, he asked, "Who are you guys?" One of the men in the group, someone who had the same unsettling aura the leader boss, spoke up. "You have 2 minutes," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you don't get to the center of the station within that time, you'll be expelled from this place. You've had a great run so far, but if you don't start moving, it might get too risky for you." The protagonist, still disoriented, tried to process what was happening. The man who had spoken seemed curious, like he was trying to figure out who the protagonist really was. But there was also a sense that his curiosity might be short-lived, that he would lose interest quickly if the protagonist didn't prove himself. "Expel me?" the protagonist echoed, his voice filled with confusion but also a hint of defiance. The assistant of the boss with the villainous aura sneered. "What do you think? You're crazy if you think you can just walk away from this." The boss with the dark aura grinned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, filled with malice. "No, it's more fun this way," he said. "Let's see your true form. Show me what you're hiding behind those eyes." He stepped closer, trying to peer into the protagonist's soul, but the protagonist stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the man's. Boss couldn't see anything in his eyes, just a void of darkness. The protagonist finally spoke, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "You should have just left when you had the chance. 2 seconds?" That's plenty of time to take you down. The assistant laughed too, a mocking sound that echoed in the room. Just as you said, boss. This guy's funny. The assistant drew a knife, the blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. Are those your last words? He asked. He tries to lunge forward, but before, the boss aura man stopped him with a raised hand. The protagonist, unfazed, reached for his pocket, only to realize with a start that the photo was gone. Panic surged through him as he looked up at the assistant of boss was holding the photo between his fingers. Looking for this? The man asked, his tone mocking. I wasn't expecting to find anything worthwhile after looking at you, but I found this. He held up the photo, and the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. A wave of cold fury washed over the protagonist. His gaze hardened, becoming a deadly glare. If there's even a scratch on that photo, I'll kill you. The boss man took photo from his assistant, intrigued by the sudden shift in the protagonist's demeanor. Oh, this must be important to you. Protagonist was getting beaten. He couldn't do anything as his photo could get ripped if he moved. The protagonist cursed himself internally. He should have been more careful. He had let his guard down, and now he was paying the price. The assistant, sensing his boss's interest, turned to him and asked, "What do we do now, boss? Should we expel him?" The boss, holding the photo, shook his head. No. When I looked into his eyes just now, I saw something different. Something deep. The inside of his soul. It's like a void. I couldn't see anything. We're going to keep watch over him. The assistant nodded. All right, boss. The protagonist knew he could easily take the photo back by force, but he didn't want to risk damaging it. It was the only thing left from his basement home, the only clue to his mother's whereabouts. He would have to bide his time and wait for the right moment. Just then, a girl, Haru, appeared. What are you doing? She asked, concerned. The boss looked at her, his eyes narrowing. Oh, there you are. Saves me the trouble of finding you. Haru, a bit nervous. Were you looking for me? After that, those people leave them there by taking photo. Haru tries to give protagonist a hand, but she just refused her help. What are you doing? I was trying to wake you up, she said, frustrated. I don't need your help, human, the protagonist replied coldly. Haru bristled at his attitude. My name isn't human, it's Haru. Get it right already. The old man thought to himself, something definitely happened. The protagonist, recalling his father's words, thought, why would I ever trust a human? They're the enemy, just like that guy who took my photo. He would wait for the right moment to retrieve it without damaging it. Now, everyone was gathered in the subway station. The boss gave them two choices, follow him or don't. Those who followed would be safe, but those who didn't, well, they could expect the same fate as the man who had been expelled. The old man, defiant in his old age, chose not to follow the boss. I'm too old to be manipulated. I'd rather die on my own terms. But as he sat down, even he would be alone, he noticed something surprising. Haru, who had also stayed behind, pointed to the others. Looks like I'm not the only fool here. Many others had chosen not to follow the boss as well. The old man was stunned but relieved. He hadn't planned on staying behind, but now that so many others had joined him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. A woman was haunted by the consequences of not following the boss's orders, fear gripping her heart. Dr. Hyung, observing her, was suddenly interrupted by a little girl who bumped into him. A man nearby gently admonished the girl for running around, but the doctor, with a kind smile, remarked that it's natural for children her age to be energetic. He advised the girl to listen to her dad. With a defiant mutter, the girl bumped her head against the doctor's face and retorted, "He's not my father." She explained that her real parents were somewhere else, likely searching for her. The man sighed and explained, "Until she finds her parents, I'm pretending to be her father." Meanwhile, guards posted by the boss blocked the doors, ensuring no one could leave the room. When the protagonist tried to step out, searching desperately for the person with his family photo, the guards stopped him cold, warning that no one, no matter how young, was allowed to leave, and those who tried would face severe punishment. In the next scene, the boss's men began distributing rations. The protagonist's group received noticeably less food than the others. When they questioned the discrepancy, the answer was chillingly simple. It's the boss's rule. A thug-like figure, notorious for his ruthless demeanor, was roused by the scent of the food. He was known as the boss's right-hand man, but his dangerous demeanor had earned him the nickname Chicken Bomb. He defied the boss's orders, acting alone, and for reasons unknown, he was also called the Left Hand, a ruthless, vicious killer feared by all. As he stalked through the corridor, the same young girl, now clutching her meager ration, accidentally bumped into him. His cold, gloomy gaze bore down on her, and she froze in terror. He warned her that it was dangerous to run around here. The two men who had been discussing him earlier watched in horror, expecting the worst for the girl. To their surprise, the man simply came towards them and asked them to replace the girl's ruined ration. They hesitated, knowing that each ration was strictly one per person. Without missing a beat, the man offered his own share to her, leaving the onlookers baffled. They wondered why this ruthless killer would show such kindness. Was this some twisted form of torment? Suddenly, a man appeared, claiming to be the girl's father before. With a calm authority, he told her to hurry and get behind him. He then turned to the others and asked, "What exactly did she do wrong?" The man who had confronted him sneered, "You got a problem with my accent?" Ignoring the threat, the father figure gently urged his pretend daughter to come with him. The girl hesitated, looking back at him with uncertainty. The man smiled at her, reassuringly. He didn't seem such ruthless. The protagonist's thoughts raced. He knew he should be focused on finding the man who had the picture of his parents, but something kept him there. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Haru, the girl he had offended earlier, glaring at him with obvious anger. Another girl was noticing them. Later that night, when everyone else had fallen asleep, the girl from earlier quietly rose. She glanced across the room and saw the protagonist, sitting in the corner. She approached him cautiously and reached out her hand. But before she could touch him, he grabbed her wrist tightly. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice cold and suspicious. The girl, startled, replied, "You're awake?" "Of course I am," the protagonist retorted. "You were going to attack me while I slept, weren't you?" "I knew it." The girl was baffled by his strength and the intensity of his distrust. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I just wanted to talk." The protagonist narrowed his eyes, still gripping her wrist. "Talk? About what? I've never seen you talk to anyone before." She sighed. "What's wrong with you? Can't we just have a conversation?" He finally let go of her hand, his suspicion still evident. "Fine, get to the point." She sat down beside him, hesitant but determined. "Why are you always keeping to yourself? Are you really that distant from everyone?" The protagonist scoffed. "This is nonsense. There's no reason for me to get close to anyone here. They're all enemies." "Enemies?" she echoed, surprised. "Why would you think that?" "Every human is an enemy," he replied coldly. "Is there a reason to trust people who turn against their own kind?" She shook her head. "I don't plan on hurting you, though." "I don't believe you," he said flatly. "You could be lying." "Maybe," she admitted. "But you should reconcile with Haru. She's hurt because of you." He dismissed the idea. "She's no different from the people outside this room." The girl's voice softened. "She might seem strong, but she cries every night, holding her breath so no one hears. She's heartbroken, you should know. Maybe you two could help each other as both of you are of same age." "Sadness is for the weak," the protagonist shot back. "If I have time to feel sorry for someone, I should be figuring out how to survive." She looked at him, her eyes searching for a sign of vulnerability. "Have you ever been sad over losing someone important?" For a moment, the protagonist thought of his father, but he quickly pushed the memory aside. "No, and I won't be, because there's no one important to me." "That sounds lonely," she whispered. "It's because you don't have someone special, isn't it?" She continued, "I'd be sad if you died." But the protagonist replied with chilling indifference, "I'll never die. And even if I did, I wouldn't care if you died first." The girl gave a small, sad laugh. "How cold," she said, coughing as she stood up. "I won't bother you anymore. Sweet dreams." As she walked away, the protagonist watched her, thinking to himself, "She's such a weird woman." The protagonist sat in the dim basement, his thoughts heavy. It had been 4 days since he came here, initially seeking only a place to rest. But now, his quest to find his mother was stalled, held hostage by a man who had taken his precious notes. Suddenly, the scene shifted. The protagonist was being beaten. With a glare, he asked his tormentors, "Is this fun for you?" The assistant of the boss, who held the photo of his parents, responded coldly, "Fun? No, it's not. This is your punishment for leaving the room." The protagonist, undeterred, shot back, "Why don't you punish me yourself and put that photo down?" The assistant hesitated, fear creeping in as he realized the protagonist's focus was solely on the picture, not on him. The protagonist recalled his father's words, "Humans are inherently weak." He was finally beginning to understand what that meant. He walked away. The girl from the night before approached him. She asked if the beating was by the boss's men. Dr. Hyung, checking his injuries, commented that they weren't too severe and suggested disinfecting them. The protagonist shrugged it off, saying, "It's fine. This much is nothing." The girl handed him a lunch she had borrowed for him. He took it, about to thank her, but stopped short. She asked what he was going to say. The protagonist replied, "Nothing." She began coughing, her breath ragged. A thought crossed his mind, but he didn't want to hurt her. Despite his usual guardedness, he considered that maybe it was okay to trust her a little. But then, she suddenly collapsed into floor. "Get a hold of yourself," he urged, but she was unresponsive. The doctor examined her and realized her condition was worsening. The problem was clear. She needed medication that was only available on the surface. The protagonist, feeling a pang of concern, questioned why he should worry for her. The doctor warned, "If we don't get the medicine now, her condition will deteriorate rapidly." The protagonist asked, "How much worse?" Before the doctor could respond, the assistant holding the photo interrupted, calling for the doctor to attend to the boss's orders. The doctor, busy with the girl, was reluctant. The assistant, wielding the photo just to keep protagonist immobilized, insisted, "The boss has ordered you to treat the injured. You must go now." The doctor tried to explain, "This patient needs urgent care." The girl, still weak, offered, "I'm fine. Just tell me where the medicine is, and I can go to the surface myself." As she tried to stand, the assistant struck her in the stomach, leaving everyone in shock, including the protagonist. She collapsed, hemorrhaging, and the protagonist watched helplessly as her life slipped away. In her final moments, she whispered by poking him, "You wouldn't care, would you?" The doctor, horrified, turned to the assistant, saying, "How can you show no emotion when someone dies right in front of you? Monsters aren't just roaming the surface." The assistant scoffed, "Old man, you're too soft. If things had stayed as they were, you would have followed her to the surface. I couldn't risk losing our doctor over a dying woman. You should be grateful." But the protagonist's glare was far from fear. It was something more terrifying. The assistant, misreading his expression, thought he had scared him. But then, the photo was slipped from the assistant's pocket, dropping to the ground as he fumbled for his knife. The protagonist seized the moment, his thoughts racing that he didn't have precious photo now. In an instant, the protagonist lunged. The room blurred with the speed of his movement. He punched his in an instant. The knife flew. He grabbed the knife midair and, in one fluid motion, pressed it against the assistant's neck. The room fell silent, everyone stunned by the swiftness of his attack. The protagonist, seething with anger, thought bitterly, "If I had known he was this weak, I would have just taken the photo and spared everyone this misery." As the assistant trembled, the protagonist remembered his father's teachings. Kill anyone who becomes defenseless. Show no mercy. But something inside him resisted. From behind, the doctor's voice broke through the tension. "Don't kill him. You can undo this. If you kill him now, there's no going back." The protagonist, his grip tightening on the knife, questioned, "Are you worried about him?" The doctor replied earnestly, "I'm talking about your heart. Think carefully. Do you really need to go this far?" The protagonist stared at the knife, his reflection distorted in the blade. He thought of his father's words, of the darkness those lessons had planted in him. But he made a choice. "I won't become like you," he muttered. tossing the knife aside. The doctor exhaled in relief. You made the right decision, he said. The protagonist, however, was resolute. It wasn't because of what you said. If I kill him, I become the same as those monsters. And there's no point in that. As he turned to leave, a nagging thought crossed his mind. Why did he care about her? She wouldn't have been of any help to him. So why did it matter? Just then, another man, sensing an opportunity, moved to strike the protagonist from behind as the protagonist, knife now out of reach. But just as the thug was about to strike the protagonist's agility took over. In a swift, fluid motion, he moved behind his attacker, grabbing the collar of his shirt and, with a powerful heave, slammed him into the floor. The force of the impact echoed through the room, and the others watched in shock. As the defeated thug lay groaning on the ground, another figure noticed the photograph that had slipped from the pocket before. The man bent down, picked it up, and held it out, and with little hesitation. This is precious to you, isn't it? He with the photo slightly. The protagonist stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the man, his expression unreadable. What are you doing? He demanded, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. The man hesitated, then handed the photo back, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Be careful with it, he muttered, his bravado faltering as the protagonist took the picture from him. In the silence that followed, another man, who had been watching from the sidelines, spoke up. If you could take him down so easily, why didn't you act sooner? The protagonist glanced at him, his gaze steady. They were holding something of mine hostage. A piece of paper, the man asked, incredulous. That's what's so important to you? The protagonist nodded with strong intent, a simple yes escaping his lips. His calm and strong demeanor only made the others more uneasy, sensing there was more to the story than they understood. Curious, the protagonist began asking those around him, have any of you ever seen a flower like this before? He showed the picture to the group, hoping for a spark of recognition. A young girl, her eyes wide with curiosity, asked, Where did you take this photo? I don't know, the protagonist replied honestly. A man with glasses, his voice laced with frustration, remarked, If we still had the internet, we could find out easily. But now, it's going to be tough. The doctor, standing nearby, looked at the protagonist and asked, Why do you want to find the location of this picture? The protagonist's answer was direct. I need to go there. But there are monsters out there, the doctor cautioned. Even with your skills, surviving out there would be difficult. The protagonist simply replied, I can survive. The others fell silent, unnerved by his confidence. The protagonist could tell from their expressions that none of them recognized the flower. Just as he had expected. Suddenly, the boss entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He noticed the thug lying on the floor, and his eyes narrowed. It was clear his subordinate had failed to follow orders and couldn't handle the picture, and the boss wasn't pleased. The protagonist, sensing the tension, carefully tucked the picture back into his pocket, preparing for what might come next. The boss clenched his fists, his stance shifting into a ready position, signaling he was prepared for a fight. Before either of them could make a move, a low rumble shook above the subway. Something massive, a monster, started digging its way through, threatening to breach the subway. In another part of the subway, where other survivors had gathered, people were trying to make do with what they had. They lacked firewood, so they collected scraps and waste to cook their meals. Among them were two girls, one young and the other was Haru, working together in silence. A man approached them, his expression hard. I have to send you back now, he said, his tone resigned. Haru, one of the girls, glared at him. Don't look at me like that, the man responded defensively. I'm just trying to survive here too. Another man, watching the exchange from a distance, thought they were bickering. But before he could intervene, the ceiling above them started to crack. Pebbles and chunks of stone began to rain down as something massive dug its way through the floor above. Panic surged through the group as they realized what was happening. A monster appeared. Meanwhile, back where the protagonist and the boss were, one of the boss's subordinates urged him to be careful. That thing is strong, boss. The boss, irritated, snapped him, thinking to himself, I don't need you to tell me that. He moved toward the protagonist, intending to assert his dominance, to remind the boy who was in charge. As he tried to lock eyes with the protagonist, he hoped to intimidate him, to see the fear hidden beneath his calm exterior. But instead, he found nothing. No fear, no emotion, just an empty void that threatened to swallow him whole. The boss trembled, his bravado crumbling as he realized he was out of his depth. His assistant, noticing his fear, asked, "Boss, what's wrong?" But the boss couldn't answer. He was too shaken by the darkness he had glimpsed in the protagonist's eyes. Suddenly, a man burst into the room, his voice frantic. "Help me!" All eyes turned to him, taking in his blood-soaked clothes. "Where did all that blood come from?" someone asked. I was just taking a nap. I've had a headache since earlier." The man stammered, but as he spoke, a grotesque sight emerged. From the top of his head, a monstrous creature began to push its way out, writhing and snarling. The boss, who had been frozen moments before, sprang into action. He recognized the monster for what it was and intercepted its attack, grappling with the man as the creature continued to emerge from his skull. The boss snatched an axe from his subordinate and, with a swift motion, severed the emerging monster and the monster within. For a brief moment, the group was relieved, believing they had been saved by boss. But their relief was short-lived as a much larger monster suddenly burst through the gate, its massive form towering over them. People had already spent much time in Subway. They were having good time where monster was not able to cause any terror in them. It was like they forget, or were trying to forget the monster and apocalypse. The sight of it sent a wave of terror through the survivors. A shouted voice, "Fight! Face it head-on. How long are you going to keep running? Do you want to repeat everything all over again?" It was the boss who was shouting. There's only one of them. It's different this time. Perhaps it was the memory of seeing the boss kill the smaller monster so easily, or perhaps it was his impassioned words, but something stirred within the group. One by one, they began to shake off their fear. "He's right," one person said. "We can do this. We just saw him kill a monster. We have nowhere else to go if we run." Encouraged, the others began to prepare themselves to fight. For the first time since the monsters had appeared, they felt a glimmer of hope. But as they looked toward the boss, hoping for leadership, they noticed something was wrong. Blood trickled from the boss's nose, and his earlier confidence was gone. Before they could react, the large monster lunged at him, tearing him apart. He had been unable to finish off the previous monster completely, and now it had come back to life, stronger than before. They thought that it was unable to kill them. Panic returned with a vengeance as more monsters began to pour into the subway. The creatures tore through the crowd, decapitating and mutilating everyone in their path. The survivors' newfound courage evaporated, replaced by sheer, unrelenting terror. The protagonist watched the carnage unfold, his expression unreadable. Among the crowd, a man with glasses, who had once pretended to be the father of a young girl, suddenly remembered her. Desperation filled his voice as he turned to leave, but the doctor grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" the doctor demanded. "My child is out there. I have to find her," the man with glasses cried, remembering his pretense daughter. "Why don't you wait?" the doctor replied, his voice grim. "If those monsters have reached the entrance, maybe it has already happened." The man, devastated, was unable to respond. But then, the protagonist moved past them, walking calmly toward the monsters. "Boy, where are you going?" the doctor called after him, but the protagonist didn't stop. He continued forward, his stance shifting into a ready position. He was going to face the monsters head-on. The scene shifts to another group, where Haru, a young girl, and a man with bandages were the only survivors. They stood paralyzed by the terrifying scene before them. The young girl, her face pale with fear, began to wail, but Haru quickly hushed her, though she was just as terrified. Haru's heart pounded in her chest, knowing that any wrong move could mean death. The young girl clung desperately to Haru's clothes, seeking comfort. Haru, trembling with fear herself, forced herself to stay calm. She asked the young girl to stay close by, knowing that she needed help. The terrified man beside them, his voice shaking, asked, "What are we going to do?" "Run away from here," Haru replied, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "But where?" the man stammered. "Monsters are everywhere, in the subway, on the surface. There's nowhere to go." Haru's gaze hardened as she looked at him. "Even so," she said, "I can't just wait here to die. I will survive, no matter what." The man was surprised by the resolve in her eyes. In that moment, he realized that she had a powerful reason to live, a reason that drove her forward even in the face of such horror. But then, the monster spotted them in their hiding place. All of them froze in terror. The man, in a desperate bid to save them, leaped toward the monster, shouting, "Run!" But Haru, already swift and nimble, had taken off the moment the man lunged at the creature. She didn't look back as the man's scream echoed through the corridor. He was quickly overpowered and killed by the monster. Back with the protagonist's group, the remaining survivors were making desperate attempts to fend off the monsters, striking with whatever weapons they could find. They knew deep down that they were outmatched, that they couldn't hope to win. But then, the protagonist stepped forward, and all eyes turned to him. Was he going to fight? The monster that had killed the boss and several others snarled and lunged at the protagonist. He dodged effortlessly, catching the creature's tentacles and using them to propel himself forward. His movements were precise and powerful. The protagonist yanked the monster out of its position, stopping it in its tracks. The doctor and others watching were stunned by his sheer strength. Another monster leaped at him, intent on killing. The protagonist dodged again, this time leaping onto its back. The creature roared in pain as he reached for the axe embedded in its body, yanking it free. Everyone watching was shocked. How had he survived the attack? To confront a monster capable of regenerating was practically a death sentence. Yet the protagonist fought alone, unflinching. As the battle raged, the protagonist remembered his father's words. Every being can die. There is a life force within them that sustains their existence. If you want to end a being, you must target that source, and only then will you know how to destroy their seed. With those words echoing in his mind, the protagonist focused. He could sense the life force within the monsters, the very core that kept them alive. As the next monster charged at him, he dodged its attack and, with a single, precise strike, aimed at the center of its life force. The creature let out a final, agonized shriek before its body crumpled, transforming into a simple ball-like structure, its essence destroyed.